What if one of the loudest voices for world peace once raised his own fist behind closed doors? What if the man who told generations to give peace a chance was the same man who, in a moment of rage, nearly beat another man to death at a birthday party over a sarcastic joke? Let that contradiction sit with you for a second. Welcome to Unraveled, where we go beyond the headlines, past the myth-making, and dig into the uncomfortable truths that history tries to smooth over. If you're someone who believes that even legends should be held to the light, then you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss an untold story. Now, let's talk about John Lennon, not the icon on posters, not the mural on the wall, not the idealized saint of anti-war anthems, but the man, the deeply flawed, emotionally combustible man behind the round sunglasses. For decades, we've been fed a narrative of Lennon as a genius with a conscience. But hidden behind the harmonies and the headlines is another reality, one riddled with volatility, personal trauma, emotional abandonment, and a streak of violence that no amount of poetic lyrics can wash clean. So why hasn't that story been told in full? To start understanding John Lennon, we have to rewind long before the Beatles, before the fame, before Yoko Ono, back to a childhood that reads more like a Dickensian tragedy than the beginnings of a rock legend. He was born in Liverpool in 1940, while German bombs fell from the sky. His father, Alfred Lennon, was already a ghost, a merchant seaman who vanished at sea, and, more symbolically, from his son's life. His mother, Julia, was charismatic, reckless, and entirely unfit for motherhood. She bounced between partners, and when Alfred did return years later, it wasn't to rebuild a family but to abduct John and sail away to New Zealand. That plan failed barely, and the fallout sent young John into the care of his Aunt Mimi, a strict, no-nonsense woman who offered stability without warmth. John Lennon's formative years were steeped in emotional confusion. His real mother came and went like a guest star, teaching him how to play the banjo and spinning Elvis records, while his aunt enforced discipline and dismissed dreams of musical ambition. When Julia was finally gone for good, hit by a car in front of Mimi's house, it wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the second time Lennon felt she had been ripped from him. The first was emotional. The second, final. This isn't just tragic background noise. This is the emotional scaffolding that held up and eventually fractured Lennon's adult life. These early fractures created an artist who was equal parts boundary breaker and bomb waiting to go off. And when fame came barreling into his life, Lennon didn't find healing. He found louder microphones, bigger stages, and more places to hide his demons in plain sight. There's a danger in romanticizing brokenness. For years, Lennon's volatility has been reframed as eccentric genius, the cost of brilliance. But when you start to dig deeper, patterns emerge that don't just suggest emotional instability, they scream it. Take, for example, his behavior toward women. His first wife, Cynthia, once said she lived in fear of his moods. One moment he'd be warm, the next storming out, throwing verbal daggers. Sometimes worse. It wasn't isolated. Lennon himself later admitted to being physically violent in his younger years, describing himself as a man who used to hit women. And yet, we still put flowers under his name, chant his lyrics like mantras, and call him the voice of a generation. Why? There's a curious silence around Lennon's darker chapters. It's as though we've collectively agreed to blur them out in exchange for the beauty of his music. But should we? Can we truly admire the art while ignoring the artist? Let's go back to one specific moment that should have ended the mythology altogether: Paul McCartney's 21st birthday. The Beatles were on the brink of superstardom. The room was filled with industry insiders, artists, and tastemakers. And then, a DJ made a playful remark about Lennon's recent honeymoon. What followed wasn't just a drunken outburst. It was a savage assault. Lennon grabbed a stick, not a metaphor, an actual weapon, and beat the man until he lay bloodied and broken. Lennon later admitted that he saw the moment as a fork in the road. One more strike, and he could have killed him. Let that sink in. Not a shove. Not a punch. A potential murder. Had he not stopped himself? This wasn't some isolated incident, but a window into the volatility that lived just beneath the surface of his public persona. And the most troubling part, the incident barely made a dent in his reputation. The press gave it a pass. The fans forgave. The myth continued, undisturbed. That's the power of charisma, of art, of selective memory. So again, we ask, can someone be both a messenger of peace and a purveyor of chaos? Does the creation of great art excuse the creation of pain? As we continue through Lennon's story in the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into his most intimate and sometimes disturbing relationships. From his bond with his mother to the explosive friendship with Stuart Sutcliffe, and the strange dynamic with Yoko Ono that many still claim tore the Beatles apart. But before we go there, ask yourself this. If Lennon weren't famous, if he were just a man in your neighborhood with this history, would we admire him? Or fear him? Stay with us. It's easy to say someone had a difficult childhood and move on. But with Lennon, it wasn't just difficult. It was warped, and it warped everything that came after it. You can't understand the violence, the obsessions, the abandonment of his own son, without going straight through the strange, often uncomfortable emotional wiring that shaped him. Let's talk about Julia, John Lennon's mother. Not the saintly figure often painted by biographers trying to balance out his troubled side, but the real woman. She wasn't cruel, but she was chaotic. She visited her son at Mimi's house like a whirlwind, cracking jokes, spinning records, teaching him how to strum the banjo. To young John, she was a breath of dangerous air, intoxicating and unpredictable. Not a mother in the traditional sense, but more like a teenager's fantasy of a cool older friend. And therein lay the problem. Lennon would later say, in a 1979 interview that has since been buried under layers of PR-approved nostalgia, that when he was just 14 years old, he found himself physically attracted to his own mother. That's not a metaphor. He described lying in bed next to her and wondering if he should go further. He didn't. But the very fact that he admitted it publicly tells us something most fans have tried very hard not to hear. Lennon's emotional compass was not just damaged. It was disoriented. Was it the absence of healthy boundaries? The yearning to connect with someone who had been emotionally out of reach for most of his life? Maybe. But that raw confession gives us a dark lens through which to view his later relationships with women, with bandmates, with the concept of intimacy itself. By the time he met Cynthia Powell, his first wife, Lennon was already developing a pattern. Charm, followed by control. Love, followed by outbursts. He wanted her near. but never equal. During their courtship, he struck her in a fit of jealousy. The reason? She danced with one of his bandmates, Stuart Sutcliffe. Her head slammed against the wall. That act alone should have raised red flags for everyone around him. But in the haze of 1960s rock culture, violence was often disguised as passion or worse, brushed off as the price of genius. Stuart Sutcliffe, that same bandmate, wasn't just another name in early Beatles history. His connection with Lennon ran deeper than most realize and possibly deeper than Lennon ever admitted. Publicly, Lennon mocked and teased Stuart. In private, Stuart wrote him emotional, deeply personal letters that spanned dozens of pages. Even Stuart's sister once claimed she believed they had an intimate relationship, not necessarily sexual, but emotionally intense in a way that bordered on obsessive. Lennon, by contrast, seemed unable to express what that bond meant except through rage. And then, in a moment that has since become shrouded in speculation, Lennon allegedly snapped. According to Stuart's sister Pauline, the two had argued about Stuart's plan to leave the band and return to art school. Lennon reportedly lost control and kicked him hard in the head. A year later, Stuart died from a sudden brain hemorrhage. Though never proven, Pauline has long maintained that the injury Lennon inflicted may have played a role. No legal consequences. No formal investigation. Just a whispered suspicion that vanished under the rising fame of the Beatles. Even if Lennon's violence wasn't the direct cause of Sutcliffe's death, the emotional fallout is undeniable. Lennon carried that shadow with him. And maybe that's what fueled his spiral in the years that followed: the guilt, the loss, the inability to express love without fear of abandonment or betrayal. It didn't stop with Stuart or Cynthia. By the mid-1960s, as Beatlemania consumed the world, Lennon had already begun emotionally withdrawing from his wife and son. When Cynthia gave birth to Julian in 1963, Lennon wasn't there. He'd opted instead for a trip with his manager, who was later revealed to be in a romantic relationship with him, another layer of complexity the public wasn't ready to confront. Lennon would later admit he barely saw his first son and didn't know how to love him. He blamed his own father's absence. But at what point does the cycle become a choice, not just an inheritance? Lennon's relationships, romantic and otherwise, followed a similar rhythm: initial connection, emotional intensity, loss of control, and eventual estrangement. Even his partnership with Paul McCartney, which gave the world some of the most iconic songs in modern history, began to crumble under the weight of Lennon's growing volatility and sense of isolation. Lennon saw rivals in everyone. He pushed people away to see if they'd come back, and when they didn't, he called it betrayal. All of this culminates in perhaps the most contentious chapter of his personal life: Yoko Ono. Depending on who you ask, she was either the love of his life or the architect of the Beatles' downfall. The truth, as usual, is messier. Lennon didn't just love Yoko, he depended on her. She became, in many ways, a surrogate for the emotional voids left by Julia, by Stuart, by a world that he never felt truly understood him. He broke every band rule to keep her close. During the White Album sessions, he brought her into the studio, literally into the recording room, and let her sit in on everything. The other Beatles were stunned. None of their wives or girlfriends had ever crossed that line. But Yoko didn't just sit quietly. She commented. She critiqued. She challenged. and Lennon loved it. To him, she wasn't a distraction. She was his new mirror, one that didn't reflect the polished public image, but the fractured inner world he'd always struggled to articulate. This was more than love. It was enmeshment, and it would soon test not only the patience of his bandmates, but the very foundation of his identity. As we peel back the next layer in Lennon's descent from the drug-fueled experimentation to the infamous Let It Be sessions where everything began to implode, we must ask ourselves, when does a man stop being a victim of his past and become responsible for the pain he causes others? Because for all his gifts, Lennon didn't just sing about revolution. He left one in his wake in every room he entered, every relationship he dismantled, and every heart he left confused in the aftermath. By the time John Lennon met Yoko Ono, he wasn't just searching for love. He was hunting for escape from his past, from his image, and increasingly, from the people who had built their lives around him. The Beatles, by then, weren't just a band. They were a global phenomenon, an institution. And Lennon, he was the reluctant cornerstone, slowly crumbling under the weight of fame, fatherhood, and the expectation to keep producing magic on command. But this is where the story takes a surreal turn. Because as Lennon's emotional world unraveled, his public image only soared higher. Albums were selling in the millions. The Beatles were cultural gods. And yet, behind the scenes, something was shifting, something that began with a dentist. Of all people. In 1965, George Harrison invited Lennon and their wives to dinner at his dentist's house. Unbeknownst to them, the coffee was laced with LSD. What followed wasn't just a bad trip. For Lennon, it was a spiritual detonation. He described it as seeing the world split open, a rupture that couldn't be reversed. And it wasn't just drugs. It was the realization that he no longer believed in the image he was performing. The screaming fans, the glossy photos, the pre-written statements, it all felt like a farce. Lennon was desperate for something real. This inner dissonance began bleeding into the music. Suddenly, the Beatles' sound evolved drastically. Gone were the sweet harmonies and boyish innocence. In came sitars, tape loops, cryptic lyrics, and psychedelic detours. Norwegian Wood wasn't just a song, it was a quiet confession of infidelity. Tomorrow Never Knows wasn't a pop track, it was a philosophical manifesto wrapped in sound experimentation. And the others noticed, especially Paul. Lennon had once called Paul McCartney his musical soulmate. But after the LSD revelation, something shifted. Lennon began pulling away emotionally, creatively, even chemically. He dove deeper into substances. Where Paul was methodical and structured, Lennon became chaotic and impulsive. Ringo Starr once said that being in a room with them at the time felt like watching two brothers who'd stopped trusting each other. Then came Yoko, not as a wedge, but as a mirror. Lennon was drawn to her intensity, her disregard for public approval, and her willingness to challenge him. He brought her everywhere, even into the inner sanctum of Beatles recording sessions. Breaking the long-standing no spouses rule, she didn't just sit in the corner. She collaborated. She offered feedback. And for Lennon, that was exhilarating. For the rest of the band, it was infuriating. The 1968 White Album was a symptom, not a cause. Each Beatle was writing in isolation. Lennon's songs were raw, often bitter. Happiness is a warm gun was more about addiction than affection. Your blues dripped with suicidal ideation. He even admitted that the song came from a place of pure despair, saying, "I felt like I was going insane." But it wasn't just music. Lennon was changing in every visible way. He grew gaunt. His eyes, once filled with mischievous charm, took on a hollow glaze. He wasn't showing up to sessions consistently. When he did, it was often with Yoko lying in a hospital bed he had delivered to the studio post-car crash, giving instructions like a spiritual advisor presiding over the ashes of the world's greatest band. At this point, people inside and outside the Beatles circle started asking, who exactly was John Lennon becoming? The answer, depending on who you ask, ranges from visionary to cult leader. Lennon's relationship with Yoko became so consuming, so insulated, that everything else faded, including Julian, his son, including Cynthia, his discarded wife, including the three men who had shared hotel rooms, writing credits, and world-changing moments with him for the better part of a decade. And then the crack became a canyon. During the Let It Be sessions in 1969 meant to bring the band back to basics, tension exploded. Cameras were rolling. The microphones were hot. And yet, nothing could hide the growing hostility. Lennon's apathy, Paul's controlling nature, George's quiet resentment. At one point, Lennon and Harrison got into an argument so fierce, George walked out. He didn't just leave the studio. He left the band. Lennon responded not with remorse, but with a threat. He wanted to replace George with Eric Clapton. That idea alone tells you everything you need to know about how frayed things had become. This wasn't the Beatles anymore. It was a Cold War between former collaborators, interrupted only by engineers and session musicians too polite to speak out loud what everyone already knew it was over. So what was really happening to Lennon during this period? Was it artistic rebirth or emotional collapse? Was he breaking out of the prison of fame or simply self-destructing in slow motion? Some would argue that Lennon was finally living honestly, that his detachment from the Beatles was necessary, even inevitable. Others would say he was acting out every unresolved trauma from childhood, testing the loyalty of everyone in his orbit until they, too, abandoned him. Just like his parents. Just like Stewart. Just like the ghost of Julia that followed him into every studio, every headline, every breakdown. It's easy to blame Yoko. For years, she was the scapegoat, the foreigner, the outsider, the woman who dared to speak in a room full of musical geniuses. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Lennon's descent was not caused by Yoko. She was the symptom, not the disease. The emotional implosion had already begun long before she walked into his life. She simply gave it shape. And so, as 1970 arrived and the Beatles officially disbanded, John Lennon stood alone, finally free, and yet utterly untethered. But what does freedom mean when you're still running from the same ghosts? When the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, many fans thought they'd witnessed the end of a musical era. What they didn't know was that for John Lennon, it wasn't just the end of a band, it was a personal reckoning. The scaffolding that had held up his identity, the brotherhood, the fame, the cultural revolution had all crumbled. What came next wasn't rebirth. It was disorientation. Freed from the machinery of the Beatles, Lennon appeared to finally have space to explore his own artistic vision. He released Plastic Ono Band, a raw, stripped-down confession booth disguised as an album. No elaborate production, no catchy refrains, just pain, distilled into music. Songs like Mother and God weren't simply personal, they were confrontational. He renounced religion, heroes, and even the Beatles themselves. The dream is over, he sang. For most fans, that was the part that hurt the most. But while Lennon seemed to be turning inward artistically, his personal life remained anything but peaceful. By 1973, just a few years into his post-Beatles era, his relationship with Yoko Ono began to fracture. The pressure was mounting. Public backlash over the Beatles' breakup had reached a boiling point, and Ono had become the convenient villain in millions of minds. The racism and misogyny aimed at her were relentless. But behind the scenes, the situation was far more complicated and far more bizarre. In a move that defies conventional understanding, Ono herself orchestrated what would later be dubbed Lennon's Lost Weekend. She suggested he leave not just emotionally, but physically and be with someone else. That someone was May Pang, their personal assistant. According to Pang, Ono didn't just approve of the arrangement. She encouraged it, hoping some distance would help heal their fractured bond. And so, Lennon, one of the most famous men in the world, quietly disappeared from Yoko's life and began an 18-month chapter in Los Angeles that played out like a cocktail of chaos, freedom, and unraveling identity. The Lost Weekend wasn't a weekend at all. It was a year and a half of artistic experimentation, drunken brawls, late-night recording sessions, and emotional whiplash. Lennon reconnected with old friends, even reaching out to Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. He began to rebuild bridges that had been scorched in the final Beatles years. He also reconnected with his son Julian, a rare and overdue moment of parental clarity. For a brief time, May Pang described their home life as surprisingly normal. Lennon cooked. He played piano. He smiled again. But the storm always found its way back. There were moments too many to ignore when Lennon spiraled. He once got kicked out of a club for drunkenly heckling the Smothers Brothers. On another night, he reportedly stormed into a packed party with a sanitary pad stuck to his forehead, shouting obscenities. These weren't quirky rock star antics. They were signs. Signs that whatever demons had driven Lennon to the top hadn't left. They were simply dressed in new clothes, alcohol instead of adulation, parties instead of press conferences. And all the while, Yoko remained a shadow. She called Pang constantly. She kept tabs. She controlled access. It's easy to dismiss this as manipulation, but the truth might be less sinister and more tragic. Neither Lennon nor Ono ever truly let go of each other. It wasn't romance. It was codependency, the kind that doesn't end with a breakup. It just changes shape. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Ono reeled him back in. How exactly remains a bit murky. Some say she told Lennon she had a vision that they were meant to reunite. Others say she simply knew how to speak to the part of Lennon that still felt lost, the part that wanted a mother more than a partner. Soon after reuniting, she was pregnant. On October 9th, 1975, Lennon's birthday, their son Sean was born. And with that, Lennon did something no one expected. He stepped away from the spotlight completely. No more albums. No more interviews. For the next 5 years, he became a full-time father, baking bread, reading bedtime stories, washing dishes. To some, it looked like peace. To others, it looked like disappearance. What most people didn't see was the lingering unease. Friends who visited during that time said he seemed distant, restless, as if he were wearing the role of domestic man, like a costume that didn't quite fit. George Harrison once said Lennon had a lot to say but wouldn't say it, that he had something behind his eyes that looked like regret. The truth is, Lennon was never built for stillness. The quiet of domestic life didn't heal him. It paused him. And as he aged, he began to look around at a world that had changed dramatically politically, musically, culturally. Punk had exploded. Disco was fading. The Beatles were now myth, not memory. And Lennon, the man who once defined rebellion, had been silent for too long. So, in 1980, he made his return. He recorded Double Fantasy with Yoko, an album that felt less like a revolution and more like a reconciliation. The songs weren't angry. They weren't even rebellious. They were tender. Sometimes awkwardly so. Beautiful Boy was a love letter to Sean. Watching the Wheels was a subtle defense of his absence. It was the sound of a man trying to re-enter a world that had moved on without him. And then just like that, it ended. On December 8th, 1980, Lennon was shot outside the Dakota, his New York apartment, by a man he had signed an autograph for just hours earlier. For bullets. Instant chaos. At 11:15 p.m. John Lennon was declared dead at Roosevelt Hospital. He was 40. And with his death, the contradictions froze in place. The violent peace activist, the absent father who wrote lullabies, the lover who hurt, the genius who sabotaged everything he built. A life that refused to fit into clean categories now became a legacy no one could fully explain. But maybe that's the point. As we continue in the next chapter, we'll turn the lens not just on Lennon's life, but on the reaction to it, the public forgiveness, the selective memory, and what it means when a society decides that talent is a reason to forget everything else. When John Lennon died, the world didn't just mourn a man. It mourned an idea, a projection of peace, rebellion, art, and transformation that had taken on a life of its own. Candlelight vigils were held around the globe. His songs echoed through city streets and suburban radios alike. Fans sobbed. Artists paid tribute. Reporters used words like martyr, visionary, and poet. But there was one word almost no one used: complicated. In death, John Lennon became simplified, neatly framed in black and white nostalgia. The edges were softened, the inconvenient details airbrushed. The man who once admitted to violence, who abandoned his first child, who pushed away every stable relationship in his life, he was recast as a flawless icon. And in doing so, society pulled off a kind of mass selective amnesia. Let's talk about that. Because when someone dies tragically, especially violently, there's a cultural instinct to sanctify them, to protect their memory, to preserve their impact by erasing their flaws. But in Lennon's case, this instinct didn't just sanitize his story, it rewrote it. Take his history with domestic violence. Lennon himself, to his credit, acknowledged it. In interviews during the 1970s, he openly stated that he had hit women in his younger years. He didn't excuse it. He called it cowardly. But those admissions rarely made the tribute montages. They never made it into the murals. They certainly didn't show up in the endless anniversary retrospectives. Because we don't want to associate the word abuser with someone who gave us Imagine. It makes us uncomfortable. But isn't that the point of reckoning? To sit with discomfort. To ask hard questions not about the dead, but about the living systems that excuse, enable, and then enshrine them. Look at how Yoko Ono was treated then and now. When the Beatles broke up, she was vilified as the root of it all. The media framed her as a manipulator. Racist caricatures flourished. Fans sent death threats. Radio hosts mocked her accent. Concert-goers held signs demanding she go home. But here's the thing. The narrative that Yoko broke up the Beatles doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The band had been splintering long before she entered the studio. Creative tensions, financial disputes, personal resentments, they were already unraveling. Yoko was simply the easiest person to blame. She was a woman. She was Japanese. She had opinions in a room where women were expected to be silent. And for that, she became the villain in a story that demanded one. Meanwhile, Lennon, the man who chose to alienate his bandmates, who brought Yoko into the studio, who ignored group boundaries, was cast as a passive figure, as if the decisions he made were somehow not his own. This rewriting of roles isn't just unfair. It's dangerous. Because it teaches us that charisma can overshadow accountability. That a compelling message can wipe away a disturbing reality. That talent, when wrapped in enough nostalgia, becomes a shield no truth can pierce. Let's talk about the media's role in this. When Lennon died, most outlets didn't revisit the Bob Wooler incident, the brutal attack at Paul McCartney's birthday party where Lennon, drunk and volatile, beat a man so badly he was hospitalized. They didn't mention the fact that Lennon later said he felt like he could have killed him that one more swing, and he would have crossed the line from rage to murder. Instead, reporters quoted "All you need is love." They played Imagine over clips of candlelit mourners, and they leaned hard into the image of Lennon as a peace prophet struck down by senseless violence. But here's the paradox. Lennon was a peace advocate. He marched against war. He used his platform to speak out against injustice. He imagined a better world not just in lyrics, but in life. The issue isn't whether those efforts were sincere. It's whether they should be allowed to eclipse everything else. Can someone be both a peace icon and a perpetrator of violence? Can a man who helped dismantle social conformity also reinforce toxic masculinity in his personal life? These aren't questions with easy answers. But they're questions worth asking, not just about Lennon, but about every public figure we idolize. Because when we elevate someone so high that criticism feels like blasphemy, we don't honor them. We distort them. We turn them into myth, which is just a polite word for a lie we all agree to tell. Consider how different the conversation would be if Lennon had lived in the era of social media. Imagine Twitter the night of that birthday party incident. Imagine Reddit threads dissecting his comments about hitting women. Imagine cancel culture doing what radio hosts and TV specials refuse to do. Ask whether Lennon's art should protect him from accountability. Would he survive the scrutiny? Would we still listen to Imagine with our eyes closed? Or would we start listening with context? This isn't an attempt to tear down Lennon. It's an attempt to widen the lens. To make room for the full truth, not just the part that fits on a t-shirt. Because legacy isn't just what someone leaves behind. It's what we choose to carry forward. And if we carry forward only the comforting half of the story, we're not remembering Lennon. We're remembering a version of him that never existed. In the final chapter, we'll confront the deeper question: why do we, as a culture, keep doing this? Why do we grant immunity to those who entertain us? And what does that say about who we are and what we're willing to ignore when the person singing the truth is also living a lie? So what does it say about us, not just about John Lennon, that we let the contradiction stand? That a man who once sang of imagining no possessions lived in luxury apartments overlooking Central Park. That the same voice calling for peace once admitted he'd nearly killed a man in a blackout rage. That someone who wrote lullabies for his second son could barely face his first. We often say people are complicated, as if that term alone is enough to excuse or explain anything. But complications are only meaningful when we're willing to hold them up to the light, not blur them out. And with John Lennon, we didn't just blur. We built an entire mythology on selective silence. That silence is not passive. It is constructed carefully, culturally, and often for comfort. When Lennon died, the narrative needed to be clean. America in 1980 was bracing for a new conservative era. The cultural revolution of the 60s had aged into memory. Lennon's assassination offered a rare chance to unify generations, to mourn an icon who had once stood for freedom, rebellion, transformation. So the Messier truths, they were tucked away, too awkward for candlelight vigils, too sharp for radio tributes. And yet, those truths never went anywhere. They stayed dormant, in books that few read, in interviews that rarely resurfaced, in the corners of fandoms where the debates weren't about vinyl pressings, but about morality. Why do we do this? Part of it is cultural convenience. It's easier to worship symbols than to confront people. Symbols don't disappoint you. People do. And Lennon, with his unforgettable voice and larger-than-life presence, offered a tempting canvas onto which millions could project their own beliefs. Anti-war protesters saw him as a comrade. Artists saw him as a pioneer. Outsiders saw him as proof that rebellion could be beautiful. But there's a difference between inspiration and exoneration. Because Lennon wasn't canceled, he was canonized. And that canonization came at a cost not to him, but to those erased by it. To Cynthia, who raised Julian largely alone. To Julian, who later admitted he felt like an afterthought, a childhood defined by absence, only to watch his father become a global symbol of love and peace. To May Pang, whose relationship with Lennon was swept under the rug because it didn't fit the romantic redemption arc we all preferred. To fans who believed they were following a prophet, only to learn too late that prophets are people too, and sometimes deeply flawed ones. There's also the question of timing. Had Lennon lived into the era of Me Too, what conversations would we be having now? Would we dig up the old stories, the assault on Bob Wooler, the admission of violence, the verbal abuse, the emotional manipulation, and see them for what they were? Or would we once again default to the old defense? But he changed. He admitted it. He made beautiful music. All true. And yet, incomplete. Because change only matters when it comes with accountability. And while Lennon spoke about growth, we have to be honest, much of that growth was claimed, not demonstrated. His regrets were often expressed in vague terms, wrapped in art, never fully confronted. He was, in many ways, more comfortable intellectualizing his flaws than repairing them. That, too, is part of the pattern. We also have to talk about how this applies far beyond Lennon. He is not an isolated case. He is a case study of how easily we forgive when we like the song, of how quickly we excuse harm when it's wrapped in charisma, of how rarely we ask who's been left in the wake of greatness. Michael Jackson, Woody Allen, Picasso, Polanski. The list stretches on a gallery of men whose brilliance came with brokenness, and whose brokenness we sometimes treated like just another shade of genius. John Lennon fits neatly into that pattern, perhaps too neatly. What would it look like to remember him entirely? To teach future generations not just Imagine, but also the moments that made that song necessary. To explain that pain doesn't justify cruelty, but that some of the most beautiful art in human history came from people grappling with exactly that tension. Would it destroy the magic? Or would it, finally, make it honest? Maybe the better question is, why are we so afraid to find out? Because there's another path. One that doesn't demand we erase legacies or cancel history. One that says, yes, Lennon changed the world. And yes, he caused harm. Both are true. Both matter. And neither erases the other. In that sense, Lennon isn't just a story. He's a mirror. He reflects our willingness to separate art from artist. Our tendency to glorify those who speak for justice even when they fail to live it. Our need to believe that brilliance comes from struggle and our discomfort when struggle turns violent. But a mirror only works if we're willing to look into it. The story of John Lennon isn't just about a man who made music. It's about the cost of turning people into myths and the people left behind in that transformation. His journey was marked by longing, rage, beauty, and contradiction. And in that, he was entirely human. Maybe the lesson isn't to stop loving his music. Maybe the lesson is to start loving the truth more. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a voice tells us to imagine a better world, we'll ask ourselves whether they're building it in their life or only singing about it. Maybe the most unsettling part of John Lennon's story isn't what he did. It's what we chose not to see. We remember the music. We celebrate the message. But in doing so, we often close our eyes to the man behind it, a man who, at times, caused real harm while calling for healing. A man whose contradictions weren't just artistic, they were personal, intimate, and painful. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real cost of idolizing someone is the silence we maintain to keep the myth intact. Not just silence toward their actions, but silence toward our own discomfort with complexity. Because if Lennon's life teaches us anything, it's that beauty and damage often share the same stage. The question isn't whether John Lennon deserves forgiveness. That's not ours to give or take. The real question is, what does it say about us as a culture when we demand honesty from our artists, but refuse to look honestly at them? What do we lose when we only listen to the song and never to the silence between the notes? thank you for staying with us until the very end. Subscribe to Unraveled so you never miss the truths the world tries to bury. We'll be here asking the hard questions, one legend at a time. See you in the next story.